I'm Tom Landy. I'm the founder and director of Collegium, which is a colloquy on faith and intellectual life. We were founded in 1992 to help faculty at Catholic colleges and universities better understand the mission of Catholic higher education and to invite and prepare them to become leaders in advancing that mission in creative ways. Collegium is best known for its annual week-long summer colloquy on faith and intellectual life that will be virtual this year, where faculty of all religious backgrounds and disciplines can learn about the legacy, the priorities of Catholic higher education, where they can think about their own vocation as teachers and scholars and discern how their commitments and talents can enhance the mission of their institution. Almost 2,000 faculty have participated in those colloquies over 27 years. Today, I'm pleased to welcome you to the last, at least for this semester, in a series of online presentations sponsored by Collegium to serve our alums and to expand our reach as well. We're welcoming Kathleen Punsalan-Manlimos, a Collegium alumna, who will soon begin a term as member of the Collegium board. She's with us today to lead a discussion that she titled Beyond Patriarchy, Women and Lay Leadership in Catholic Higher Education. For the last several years, Catherine has served as assistant to the president for mission integration at the University of Detroit Mercy. She's been active in Jesuit education for more than 30 years, beginning at the Ateneo de Manila University in the Philippines. After completing her doctorate in systematic theology at the University of Notre Dame, she began teaching her teaching career back at the Ateneo. She then served as associate professor of theology and religious studies at Seattle University, where she was the inaugural director of the Institute for Catholic Thought and Culture and held the Malcolm and Mari Stamper Endowed Chair in Catholic Intellectual and Cultural Traditions. In addition, she did direct the Catholic Studies program in the College of Arts and Sciences. But more recently, she launched that new phase that I mentioned of her career at University of Detroit Mercy. She's won awards for her teaching and research and is past president of the Pacific Northwest American Academy of Religions, Society of Biblical Literature. She served on the board of the College Theology Society and the administrative team of the Asian American Theology Consultation of the Catholic Theological Society of America. Catherine's topic is, of course, hugely important for the Church. The title, Beyond Patriarchy, Women and Lay Leadership in Catholic Higher Education, also suggested to me a very delicious irony, or at least a well-seamed timing, as I prepare to step down after almost 30 years in my role at Collegium. With unreserved delight, I'll be passing the baton in a year to the great Karen Eifler, recently chosen as Director-elect of Collegium. So this seemed especially timely, and Karen graciously agreed to respond to and moderate today's discussion. She's professor of education at University of Portland and co-executive director of the Garaventa Center for Catholic Intellectual Life and American Culture. She's co-author of Becoming Beholders, Cultivating Sacramental Imagination and Actions in College Classrooms, which won 3 national prizes and features the wisdom of 20 Collegium alums. As I've said elsewhere, there's no one who has served Collegium in so many different ways or who better embodies the spirit that makes Collegium unique, enriching, and rewarding an experience as it is than Karen. I want to note today that our conversation is being recorded and that it is partly a way of helping our presenter, Catherine, hone a manuscript for publications in a forthcoming volume, Catholic Higher Education in Light of Catholic Social Thought, Critical Constructive Essays, edited by another Collegium alum, Bernard Prusak, and by Jennifer Reed Bully. It's forthcoming from Paulus Press. And finally, before I forget, I promised to put in a plug today, having just learned about an event at St. Mary's College in California, one of our Collegium member schools. The event is this weekend. It's a panel discussion on the role of women as leaders in the Catholic Church, and I will drop a link to that into the chat for people to connect to. So welcome, Catherine. Welcome, Karen.
Thank you, Tom. And thank you for that very generous introduction. It always makes me nervous when I hear introductions like that because I don't know how I'll live up to the expectation that sets. But I was reminded as you were giving it of what I loved about my Collegium experience. I think you told the story about how you create an atmosphere that's very different from our other academic atmospheres. You had an image, I won't repeat the image about the dog, but some of us, others on this call might have already heard that particular story. And so the invitation just to this collegiality and just sharing ideas is what I'm going to use to comfort me and sort of slow down my heart as I share with you my talk for this I guess, afternoon for all of us at this point. Beyond Patriarchy, actually, the title was inspired by the two co-editors of the volume. At first, the original title was After Patriarchy. And I suggested that I don't know that we're quite done with patriarchy just yet in the Catholic Church. And so I suggested shifting the title a little bit to Beyond Patriarchy. And again, I want to begin by thanking you, Tom, for welcoming me into this conversation with Collegium colleagues and for hosting this event. And of course, I want to thank both Jennifer and Bernard for inviting me to participate in contributing to this volume. And Karen, thank you so much for agreeing to be my conversation partner and engaging my work in progress. Our initial exchange has already proven to be so fruitful for my thinking. So I look forward to our future conversations as you step into your role as Executive Director of Collegium. I want to note that I come to this conversation as someone whose first experience of Catholic higher education and doing theology was in a different country, as Tom noted. And it would only be in graduate school and thereafter that I experienced both the context of higher education and theology in the United States. I feel it's important for me to note my context for all of you. And while it's taken time for me to realize, it's from experiences of feeling hyper visible and invisible in various academic spaces in the United States that I've discovered what I might offer to this conversation. And quite frankly, I imagine that women religious and other lay Catholics draw from historical experiences of exclusion and invisibility in the church as they make their distinctive contributions, as well as we are all called upon to take visible leadership in Catholic higher ed. Essentialized understanding of womanhood and a clericalist approach to priesthood create the experience of second-class status for women and for the laity in the church. And yet our current historical moment makes us keenly aware of the fact that exclusion deprives not only the church, but society and Catholic higher ed of the gifts of so many from marginalized communities. So I understand the invitation to contribute my chapter as an invitation to reflect on this specifically through the lens of Catholic social tradition. So what I'd like to try to do in sharing this work in progress is offer some pieces of the thinking that's informing my ongoing reflections, and then hopefully have conversations with Karen and with all of you to help me develop as I continue to develop my thinking. My entry into conversations about higher education comes from a desire to understand the world in which I now find myself moving. I came to theology many decades ago when I made the startling discovery as an undergrad in the Philippines that, and these are the words I used then, I can be Catholic and think. That faith could be subjected to critical study, and scripture and tradition had historical and cultural contexts that shaped them, and that we could actually read these through our own historical and cultural context was actually a startling discovery for me. I learned that there's a Catholic intellectual tradition, and within this Catholic social tradition that could inform activism that I'd already found myself engaged with as an undergrad. And so when I began to focus more consciously on Catholic higher education in the United States, I found myself quite excited to delve more deeply into things like the Land O'Lakes statements and Ex Corde Ecclesia, as well as seminal writings of the last four superior generals of the Society of Jesus on Jesuit education, like Pedro Arrupe's Man for Others. I know a lot of folks in Jesuit higher ed want to say it's men and women with and for others, but the original document honestly was Man for Others. I'm Jesuit educated and have been at Jesuit institutions except for a brief foray with the Congregation of the Holy Cross doing graduate work at Notre Dame. In the beginning of this emerging interest in Catholic higher ed, it never occurred to me to read these documents with an attention to what is missing, the excluded voices. That is not until the last couple of years when I joined University of Detroit Mercy, which has the distinction of being sponsored by both the Society of Jesus and the Religious Sisters of Mercy. For example, it never occurred to me to pay attention to who was present at the crafting of the Land O'Lakes statement, which has had a profound influence on the understanding of Catholic higher education in this country. I had not paid attention to the fact that the signers of the statement were all men, predominantly clerics from some of the most prominent Catholic institutions at the time. I didn't even pay attention to the care they took to name the context of the statement, the kinds of schools whose concerns would not be included, and those they acknowledge were part of these larger universities, but were not in the conversation. I will note that while they were keenly aware of the presence of non-Catholics at Catholic universities, for example, and the loss of their absence in their conversation, there was no similar explicit mention of the loss due to the absence of women or a considerations of women's colleges in the crafting of this document. But this should be no surprise, given the impetus for the document and the fact that the institutions represented were not yet co-ed when it was being drafted. They were all men's universities at the time, which would have been true for most of the Catholic universities internationally. I mentioned the Land O'Lakes statement because in the slice of the Catholic education world I know, this is an important document, marking an important kind of declaration of academic freedom and autonomy. Its importance for Catholic institutions of higher learning should not be underestimated. Nevertheless, it should be noted that the concerns of women's colleges, of institutions established by women religious, are totally absent from a pivotal document that has helped shape thinking around Catholic higher education in the United States for the last half century. While women's Catholic colleges numbered at about 142 at their peak, they continue to be missing from much of the literature on Catholic higher ed and higher ed more broadly. The volume Women's Catholic Colleges in America, edited by Shire and Rosette, begins to rectify this by chronicling this rich history. And I believe Tom has a chapter in that volume. In it, Jill Kirk-Conway notes that, and I quote, "The conventional perception of Catholic women's institutions as backward-looking agents for fostering middle-class ideals of gentility overlooks their striking capacity to institutionalize ideals of social justice left out and ignored within the higher educational system." The cultural context found in the church and American society in the late 19th and early 20th century, during which these institutions began to be established, created both the obstacles and the necessity of their establishment. The cult of domesticity that characterized the understanding of the role of women in both church and society at best saw the higher education of women as enabling them to be better prepared for marriage and being able to raise good sons. Within the Catholic community, there was the resistance to such education as it may encourage young women to turn away from domestic roles. Besides, there was really actual doubt as to the intellectual ability of women for higher education. Nevertheless, the rise in the socioeconomic standing of an increasing number of Catholics meant the desire of more Catholic women to obtain higher education. And the options that were often left them were non-Catholic women's institutions, which were seen as a threat to their faith. This opened up the opportunity for the establishment of a number of institutions by women religious communities to serve this underserved community of Catholic women. Bishops who had long failed to see the value of offering such education to women saw Catholic women's colleges as a way to forestall the perceived threat of non-Catholic institutions to these women's faith. They also hoped to influence these institutions to educate women for domestic life, something that many of these colleges were well able to resist. Women religious had been in the business of serving underserved communities. They were called upon by bishops to serve poor immigrants through education, healthcare, and other social services. They were eventually permitted to serve middle and upper class women as more and more sought, again, and afforded higher ed. Women religious established these colleges with a view to address real needs and not just the needs of emerging middle class women. For example, it was St. Catherine Drexel and the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament who founded Xavier University in Louisiana in 1925, the first Catholic college to accept not only African-American women, but African-American men, as they too were not accepted at other Catholic colleges and universities at the time. These colleges were established and flourished through the dedication and sacrifice of women religious who not only led, but staffed these institutions for decades. Thus, changes that took place after Vatican II, which included the sharp decline of the number of women religious, as well as the growing co-education offered by the larger Catholic universities, led to a loss of a significant number of these institutions. While a number closed and a number disappeared as they joined with larger men's universities, many more innovated and adapted to the shifting environment, still guided by the commitment to serve the underserved. Allow me to offer 3 examples, again, drawing from the volume I mentioned earlier, specifically a chapter authored by Dorothy Brown and Carol Hurd Green. Trinity Washington University began as the first Catholic women's liberal arts college in 1897. It was founded to educate white, middle, and upper middle class women. Today, its student body is predominantly African American and Latina. About 80% of the undergraduate students are eligible for Pell Grants, and about 10% of the undergraduate women are dreamers, undocumented students with DACA status. They have about a 5% enrollment of young men in their co-ed programs in the graduate and professional schools. Mount St. Mary's of Los Angeles, founded by the St. Joseph Sisters of Carondelet, in 1925, and I'm quoting here, came early to the realization that respect for and education towards diversity are central components of institutional responsibility to students and to the community, end quote. And so by 1960, the student body reflected the diversity of the city they were in. Today, 75% of the student body identify as Hispanic, API, or Black, and another 11% as other or multiracial. And it's still 90% women. The innovation that these institutions made was not just by diversifying their student body, by identifying new underserved communities. Take, for example, Alverno College, started by the School Sisters of St. Francis as a one-year normal school in 1887. Their adaptation over time included a significant educational innovation under the leadership of Sister Joelle Reed by creating a curriculum based on outcomes assessment, focusing on who their students are and asking the question of how to attain their desired outcomes for these students. They were willing to turn to corporate America to learn methods of assessment, and they adapted these to higher education and developed teaching methods to attain their desired outcomes. And they became so good at this, they became sought after nationally to help others, to educate others in these methods. These are 3 but quick examples of how women leaders, guided by the commitment to serving the underserved, adapted to the challenges that they faced, which included decreasing enrollment and increasing costs, familiar challenges to higher education today. Point of pride for Catholic higher ed is the fact that we can boast of faring better than the broader US higher educational landscape when it comes to women's leadership. 35% of Catholic colleges and universities are led by women, while the number for other colleges and universities is 30%. So we can be very proud of that fact. Within the AJCU, which Holy Cross is a part of, and the University of Detroit Mercy, where I am, the association currently has 3 women presidents among 27, with a 4th about to join the group. And the first woman president, Linda Lemura, actually is the first woman who is not avowed religious to have led a Jesuit university in the United States. But I'd like to remind folks, because often forgotten, the very first woman president of a Jesuit institution is Sister Maureen Fay, a Dominican sister, who was president of Mercy College when it merged with the University of Detroit in 1990, and was asked to become the first president of the produced merger, University of Detroit Mercy. She was president until 2004. It's arguably a consequential move that contributed to the continued vibrant presence of the Mercy charism at the university. So it's through the lens of my 1.5 years or so at Detroit Mercy that I want to continue sharing with you some of my thinking. The coming together of Mercy College and the University of Detroit is a rare story of merger, of a larger institution, a male institution with a smaller women's college that has not led to the effective disappearance of the charism of the women's order in the life of the university. The merger that led to Detroit Mercy happened 30 years ago. Today, the efforts to mine the riches of dual sponsorship feel like they're entering a new stage. There is a desire to move beyond finding the common denominator between the two charisms, to bring to light what is shared by both and what is unique to each, to name what makes the university distinctive. Other institutions that have tried similar mergers or partnerships have often led to the disappearance of the influence of the women's religious order. At Detroit Mercy, there's a current conversation among a handful of people with deep knowledge of one or both of the history and charism of the two sponsoring orders. And the intent is to identify a process to help the university name what it means when it claims to be Mercy and Jesuit. In my own reading, reflecting, and leading programs intended to help answer this question, I'm keenly aware of how learning about the Mercy charism is enabling me to see the Ignatian tradition I've known for 30 years from a different light. Ignatius of Loyola, who's founder of the Society of Jesus, and Catherine Macaulay, founder of the Religious Sisters of Mercy, led such very different lives in very different times and places, and so inspired different approaches to education shaped by their context. And yet at the same time, they also came to many things in common. Among these is holding together contemplation and action. And as I've come to learn the story of Catherine, I've known the story of Ignatius for over 30 years now, I found myself attending to what's similar and what's different about both, even as it pertains to this notion of contemplation and action. And I think their stories help kind of shed light on this. Catherine Macaulay was an Irish Catholic woman who was born during a period when the penal laws that had long been used to oppress marginalized and disenfranchised Irish Catholics were just being lifted. And while her father was able to do relatively well for his family, many Irish Catholics of the time were impoverished, uneducated, and continued to suffer the consequences of legalized oppression of a people for over a century. While growing up with relative means, she would lose both parents by the time she entered adulthood. And her two younger siblings and she would live on the generosity of family members who took them in. But the story that's told about Catherine is of a 5-year-old girl who had witnessed her father and his concern for those who were poor. And this was said to be transformative for her and gave her an example by which to live her life. And so in her early 20s, when she was taken in by the Callahans, Quakers, who helped her learn about scripture and whose faith would welcome Catherine's compassion and concern for poor children and women, would allow her to open their homes to welcome poor children and women. And she cared for the couples of their illness and their eventual passing, something she did for her own mother. And they left her with a small fortune that she used to start the House of Mercy, a place in which she would take in poor women and children to educate them so that they could improve their circumstances. In telling you this story, what I want to underscore is for Catherine, she encountered God in her work with the sick, with poor women and children, and she cultivated a life of prayer and reading and developing spiritual friendships around that. But her entry point was this work of mercy that she had learned from early childhood and continued into her adult life. The young Ignatius, who's the founder of the Society of Jesus, has a totally different story. He's a minor noble who lived some 3 centuries before Catherine. And he was a young man who lived a privileged life with ambition for greatness until the fated event in Pamplona with a cannonball that shattered his leg and led to his many months of convalescence. It was in bed with books and his imagination that the Spirit would finally get his attention and begin to enable him to imagine and affectively experience what it would look like to live a life for God. The spiritual work that God accomplished in him, as one reads his autobiography, is during his recovery. And this led him to turn away from courtly life and pursue a life of radical simplicity with a desire to share what God was teaching him with others by helping them experience what he had experienced, by teaching them the spiritual exercises he would say he had learned from God. In this new state, he too would be drawn to caring for the sick and being among the poor, but most importantly, he wanted to preach and teach the spiritual exercises as a way to God and to interior freedom. But he lived in the time of the Inquisition and he didn't have the proper credentials to do the work that he did, however correct his theology may have been. So he was forced to get an education, which would eventually lead him to meet the men who would help him form the Society of Jesus. Again, I tell you his story because what I want to underscore for him is how his conversion experience is in isolation in prayer with books and his imagination. And it's in this mode of contemplation that he's led out into the world to do the good works. I'm fascinated by how contemplation and solitude was where Ignatius experienced God teaching him like a schoolboy. And he would say, as he would say, and how it's in doing works of mercy, attending those in need, where Catherine saw the face of Christ, as in Matthew 25. As I learn more and more about mercy, I'm starting to appreciate that the Ignatian lens to which I've understood the world is just that, a lens. I've noticed how words that I have heard in the Ignatian world, in this male world, in a somewhat peripheral way, are central in the mercy network, or the pockets of my institution where mercy is more dominant than Jesuits. Words like relationship, hospitality, compassion. A former colleague at Seattle U, Leishuan, he always used to say that it's about relationships, relationships, relationships. When he would say this, it would resonate with me, but the word was not one I would have understood as Ignatian. In the mercy world, I've learned that relationship is a foundational word, much like reflection, or more robustly, discernment, is foundational in the Jesuit world. Don't get me wrong, I know that Jesuits believe in these values as well, values like hospitality, but it is not among the first words to come to mind if one were trying to speak Ignatian. Compassion doesn't show up among the core values of at least the Jesuit institutions that I've surveyed, but it appears among a number of mercy colleges and universities. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that these values aren't important in the Ignatian world. I'm just saying they don't tend to surface as the ones that are most articulated. And this for me is interesting. Again, words like relationship, hospitality, and compassion surface in the mercy world. And while they are robust in the Jesuit world, they don't surface as sort of distinctively Ignatian language. What I'm trying to suggest, and I hope to articulate with greater clarity in my chapter for the volume, is, as my title suggests, we need to move beyond patriarchy and look to those who have been and arguably still are marginalized in church and society for the knowledge, wisdom, and innovation that their experiences make possible, but have been excluded in exclusively patriarchal, or more accurately, white, male, cisgendered Catholic clerical lens. We've been moving slowly beyond this lens, but I think it is important that we keep in mind why. It's not simply because working for diversity and being inclusive is what is expected today. It's because we'd be offering an impoverished form of education if we do not invite the knowledge, insight, wisdom, and innovation that comes from diverse experiences to shape the kind of education we offer our students. In the examples I've given, it's just around gender, the women religious orders and the male Jesuit world that I've come to know. To argue for diversity in leadership is simply to argue for ensuring that the richness that comes from such diversity be allowed, encouraged, actively pursued, to ensure that we live more fully into the Catholic small c, along with Catholic big C, of what we call Catholic higher education. This includes learning from the adaptability, ingenuity, and creativity of women leaders of Catholic women's institutions, whose commitment to serving the underserved has been a catalyst for responding to changing circumstances in higher education. While much of the body of writings, approaches, and slice of the Catholic social tradition that are unconsciously informing these conversations often have a heavily patriarchal, and by these conversations, I mean this is part of a series of conversations in Catholic social thought. And the idea of Catholic social thought that had been informing these conversations has been unconsciously, I think, heavily patriarchal, Eurocentric, or in orientation. Much of what we encounter in Catholic social teachings are, after all, documents largely written and informed by the thinking of those whose experiences of the global North. I want to suggest that the pontificate of Pope Francis offers us some hope that we are moving beyond at least a particular form of patriarchy. I don't want to overstate this, but it seems to me that the first Latin American Pope, the first Pope from the global South, is offering something a little different. Many have said that this difference is because Francis is also the first Jesuit Pope. A former colleague at Seattle University, Jeanette Rodriguez, would always counter this and say that it's because he is Latin American. It is only now that I'm swimming in Jesuit mercy waters that I'm coming to a deeper appreciation of Jeanette's words. Maybe it isn't so much because he's Jesuit, but he knows he has some experiences from the global South. One of the striking things I noticed from the first encyclical he released in his name was how filled it was with examples of challenges so close to the ground, to daily life. Then it became apparent that he wanted to draw from the wisdom of bishops from around the globe, quote bishops' conferences from the continents. He opened Laudato Si by drawing on the wisdom of Patriarch Bartholomew and Fratelli Tutti from Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Tayeb, making clear through action his conviction that wisdom comes from other traditions. So as someone whose theological areas of interest are religion and science on the one hand and liberation theology on the other, I appreciate his repeated call to draw on knowledge offered by different disciplines, by different sources and organizations, by different cultures and communities. So what I'm trying to suggest here is that Pope Francis, coming from the global South, is more open and is inviting and is drawing from these more global sources. I have to confess, it's still largely patriarchal, but it's open to greater diversity, and so in that it's expanding beyond a totally Eurocentric and even purely clerical sources in the way that he writes his encyclicals. Sadly, I noted during a close examination of the sources that Francis actually cites in his encyclicals and key apostolic exhortations. There's still far too few references to the works of women. Bracketing the Querida Amazonia, where he cites 2 Latin American women poets, Francis has actually only cited one other woman in his major writings, and that's specifically Therese of the Child Jesus. Nevertheless, while dialogue has not traditionally been named or listed among the principles of Catholic social teachings, I do think that Francis's emphasis on this is a major contribution to Catholic social thought and invites a serious consideration of dialogue as an overarching principle in thinking about Catholic social teachings. Benedict XVI, for example, calls for dialogue as well, but it's often referenced with dialoguing with God or the dialogue of faith and reason. And when he talks about a broader notion of dialogue, he often says it with a sense of caution against what he calls cultural eclecticism or relativism. John Paul II had a more positive approach to dialogue, and I think lays the groundwork for various forms of dialogue Francis invites. Francis develops the idea of dialogue, describing its dynamics and offering various examples of dialogue. Laudato Si calls for dialogue, for example, with and among religions, ecological movements, indigenous peoples, disciplines, especially sciences, and dialogue among stakeholders in decision-making, between politics and economics. So just this appreciation of the diversity of voices and diversity of wisdom, drawing from these different voices. And I think this is what we're finding in our universities today, this invitation for us to enter into these kinds of dialogues, or at least the possibility of it. And I think there is grounding in Catholic social teachings, especially in the writings of Francis, to suggest that this is exactly the approach we should be taking. In Fratelli Tutti, for example, he states explicitly that dialogue is necessary for fraternity. He notes, and I quote, "The risk of succumbing to cultural sclerosis is always present, That is why we need to communicate with each other, to discover the gifts of each person, to promote that which unites us, and to regard our differences as an opportunity to grow in mutual respect. Patience and trust are called for in such dialogue, permitting individuals, families, and communities to hand on the values of their culture and welcome the good that comes from others' experiences. Creating a culture of dialogue, I think, is what's necessary, and it's part of the wisdom that I think we can draw from women's leadership and from lay leadership. It's necessary to draw on the riches that can come from diversity, that makes possible interdisciplinarity and interculturality. It is what inclusion looks like, and it is what will make it possible to discern how we move forward to create equity. Dialogue, the genuine dialogue, as the Pope describes it, invites recognizing the dignity of persons. It is the path to determining the common good. It is the skill that our students need to bring about change and undertake work for justice. It is the approach that leaders need to take, whether in the academy, society, or church, to begin to actualize other principles of Catholic social teachings. Women and many lay leaders in Catholic higher education bring experiences and voices that have long been overlooked in the church and in Catholic higher education. In the current landscape of higher education, with the decreasing population of traditional college students, Catholic women's colleges and universities and their attention to serving and innovating to serve the underserved and the excluded have much to teach us. And what Pope Francis calls for in terms of dialogue is an invitation for us to bring the various voices of lay leaders into our institutions. I think what I want to suggest in presenting this to you is there is within Catholic social teaching this invitation to include more and more voices, more and more lay leaders within Catholic institutions, because the richness of their experiences, which is very different from the often, again, clerical patriarchal models that had persisted in the past, would enrich the Catholic education that we offer our students, and quite honestly would reflect the student body that we know our institutions are now serving. At the same time, we need to acknowledge that an increasing diversity within our Catholic colleges and universities brings real challenges. The welcoming of more diverse students, faculty, staff, and lay leaders make it more difficult to ensure the continuity of the mission and identity of these institutions. After all, the timing of having Father X or Sister Y or the community of fathers, sisters, and brothers as guarantors of mission and identity is fast fading, if not long gone. And more of those who have received the needed credentials for leadership, like yourselves, are increasingly less and less familiar with the Catholic intellectual traditions that they are by virtue of being leaders at such institutions to preserve, hand on, and animate. Often the stories of the founding orders and their charism are even less familiar. As language like service, solidarity, and the common good find their way into the marketing strategies, even of state institutions, Catholic colleges and universities must be able to continue to articulate and draw from an understanding of the long tradition of which they are a part, and that continue to animate their commitment to these values. But it cannot simply be knowledge, but experience and appreciation, as well as commitment to these traditions. So what might we do to make this possible? That is to ensure the continuation of this even when Sister X and Father Y have long gone. Allow me to offer 3 quick thoughts. Many of us know that engagement with CST is often one of the easiest ways to introduce colleagues to the Catholic intellectual tradition. Shared commitment to social justice is what often draws faculty, for example, to our institutions. I'm discovering more and more that however faculty colleagues may feel about the Catholic Church, they're willing to engage the intellectual tradition. I suspect that many of you have similar experiences. But often we lament that the shared concern for social justice is often without connection to the Catholic social tradition that grounds this commitment at our institutions. This is why I want to suggest, as my second point, that Land O'Lakes had it right in emphasizing the importance of having a robust theology department, or at least more practically for many of our institutions, a critical cohort of theologians and others with expertise in the Catholic intellectual tradition to ensure being able to connect institutional commitment to social justice to the faith tradition that animates it. Finally, with regard to forming lay leaders more broadly, allow me to tell you, well, let me just do this. Allow me to just say, I think it's important and critical to have programs like Collegium, which all of us have experienced, as a way to introduce people, as Tom said in his introduction, to this rich intellectual tradition. I've been fortunate to have come out of institutions like Seattle University, where there exists such robust programs and opportunities for faculty to engage not only the intellectual tradition, but the spirituality of the Society of Jesus, as well as opportunities to engage community because of the commitment to justice of these institutions. So the creation of such programs, I think, for lay colleagues is critical to ensuring the identity of Catholic colleges and universities as we move into increasing diversity among our leadership. And as Pope Francis tells us, and let me just close with this thought, there can be no dialogue with others without a sense of our own identity. And at the same time, our own cultural identity is strengthened and enriched as a result of dialogue with those unlike ourselves. But as we continue to become increasingly more diverse institutions and increasingly have more women and lay colleagues as leaders of our institutions, I think it becomes critical to also ensure a deep understanding of the intellectual tradition that grounds the commitments of Catholic colleges and universities. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to you, Karen.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was a tour de force, a lot of information in a very compact package. I just want to offer two quick takeaways, and then a couple of tensions that I think will lead into some generative Q&A and conversation among all of us. One was on our campus, one of the things that we're talking about is, to the extent that we can talk about stuff in the absence of water coolers, is decolonialization, which I have to admit was a new concept to me last summer. And I thought that the way that you approached your topic, starting with that Land O'Lakes, was a really portable takeaway for anybody who might be interested in notions of decolonializing syllabi or courses, where starting with an investigation or just a simple question: who was there? Who decided what was important? Who wasn't there? And does that matter? I mean, there's not always one right answer there, but I thought that you gave us a really nice model that's portable across a lot of contexts. So I'm grateful for that. And the other thing I thought was amazing was you gave us a real sense both of mercy charism and Ignatian charism, being almost comprehensive and succinct at the same time, which is a really hard thing to pull off. So thank you so much for that. Now I want to get to a couple of tensions and invite you to address them, and then open it up to conversation, mindful that we have 14 minutes to get to a conclusive and pervasive truth that will work in all times. I kept track both in the written version and when you were talking about the number of times you said the mission of women's institutions and focus is serving the underserved. All right, baked into their DNA. That phrase showed up. I needed more than two hands to count the number of times that you noted. That is a very authentic way of leaning into the world as a religious community of women. And then in your exposition of Ignatius, all of this came to him laying in a bed, recovering from an injury. So lots of time to think about stuff. And one of the things that occurred to me was, when you are busy serving the underserved, and when you are constantly scrambling for resources to do that, there's a lot of doeating and not a lot of ideating. And I was reminded of the tension that in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus famously goes to Martha and Mary's house at Martha's invitation. And Martha's busy in the kitchen. Mary's laying at Jesus' feet, soaking it all in. And I just love it when Jesus says, "Martha, Martha, Mary has chosen the better," listening and taking it all in. And I've always struggled with that as a recovering Martha, all right, trying to serve the underserved. And somebody pointed out to me that Jesus isn't saying Mary's way is better, he's kind of upset because it was actually Martha who issued the invitation and then was busy in the kitchen not listening. And so one of the tensions I want to draw out of your commendable work is the tension between duating and ideating, between contemplation and action. And it seems like one of the I don't want to say weakness, but one of the tough truths is that women were so busy doing and serving that there isn't a long contemplative history or a long written history of the idea and the contemplation. And that has boiled over into our very teemingly busy lives in higher ed. And I wonder if in your work in faculty formation at Detroit Mercy, if you have found some ways, because you've got both the contemplatio, the contemplation of Ignatius, and the service and action nonstop of Mercy, if there are some creative ways that you might share with us about balancing that tension, the need for stopping and thinking before we just plunge in and do, that we're so frantically busy that we're not allowing ourselves to discern, to pray, to breathe.
Thanks for that question, Karen. Actually, you've had me thinking about this, and I realized there's just so many layers and so many ways to do it. Let me just answer on the programmatic level first, which is how you frame it, because I think there's a bigger kind of really interesting question that you raise. I think programmatically, one of the things I've realized in my role, especially during this time of the pandemic, is the necessity of creating very intentionally those kinds of spaces for people to pay attention to themselves in terms of, just so that they do have that time of pause, which you're describing, which feels really critical. And honestly, I've had to kind of intentionally do that with myself, right? To have that time of pause instead of trying to program for a pandemic time. And the reality that we all know, because I suspect many of us have done this, if not all of us, is this a simple fact that when you do that, your thinking is actually clearer. Right? Creative juices actually flow. So programmatically, what I've tried to do is I've tried to create spaces precisely for reflection, but often in a way that frames it so that people have an opportunity to think about the work, the meaning and purpose of the work that they're doing. Right? But I think you also intentionally or unintentionally have hit upon one of the things that we're discovering in these conversations about with the Jesuit and the Mercy charisms. Not only do we have 450 years of thinking and writing on the Jesuit side, and we have couple of hundred years on the Mercy side, but the Sisters of Mercy will readily admit they've been so about the doing, and I want to underscore, and the praying, right? Which is a different movement. They haven't really been as much about the writing, which is, again, a different movement. And I'm just struck by, in our work, and I think this Collegium did this so well for me experientially, right? It's not just the intellectual, right, and the contemplative in terms of the prayer piece, but the going out as well. So these are three different movements, right? Engaging with the world, which the sisters were great at, and they came back and reflected and thought about this. What they spent less time doing was writing, right, about the work that they were doing, kind of theorizing, if you will, about. But if you look at the Jesuit world, there's such rich theorizing and such rich contemplation. And I think, I dare say, for some Jesuits, one of the struggles is going back out into the world, right? To tend to the poor, to tend to the sick, to tend to those on the margins. I think that's the bigger challenge. So I think there's two different challenges. That's why I love my context, because I can draw from both of these traditions and then ask the question how we bring the wealth of each to give us something really robust that's Jesuit and Mercy. I hope that begins to get at the question.
Oh, it begins to scrape the surface. I mean, what do other people find in their work, in their institutions about, is there room for thinking about stuff and slowing down while you're busily achieving at high levels?
Can I offer a concrete example, sorry, from Seattle U as people are thinking about your question to them, Karen? One of the favorite things I did at my previous institution at Seattle University was creating spaces of interdisciplinary conversations among faculty colleagues that invited them to bring their expertise over an extended period of time around a given social issue. But in the shared time together, I learned this from Tom in Collegium, I'm gonna have to say, to create a space though, where people feel, where we invite people to come as whole persons, both bringing their intellectual expertise, but their experiences, and to trust in learning to teach them to attend to movements within themselves using Ignatian spirituality. So it's an academic intellectual context that also draws on the spirituality. And we would focus on specific issues, salient issues. We had 1 year environmental justice, 1 year around race. We had another year where we looked at women in the church, interdisciplinary, but bringing in the spirituality to kind of inform how you're present in the space.
I'll call your attention to John's comment that kind of reinforcing the idea that while one body of folks was writing about stuff, the other was busy doing the work. Maybe that's just an occupational hazard. Another tension I wanted to call our attention to, and I think actually, Catherine, you've been thinking about this since your undergraduate years. You said that the language you used was your discovery that you could be a Catholic and think. And I would add on something that I find really challenging as an aspiring woman leader in Catholic higher ed, to be a Catholic woman and think. And the tension I'd like to name is the tension between that, embracing possibility of thinking and being Catholic and a whole integrated person on the one hand, and reconciling that with how can a thinking woman participate in, contribute to, tolerate a church that is relentlessly clerical and masculine. That thinking Catholic in itself is a contradiction in terms, but we're not just running out of vowed religious on our campus, and we're not just running out of people who remember the vowed religious on campus, which you name, but we're actually coming up short with people who have positive connotations of organized religion, period, let alone Catholicism particularly. What advice or what insights might you offer about that tension?
It's interesting. The first thought that comes to me as I hear you articulate the question in this time is, I think that's where the value of having diverse voices and a more diverse community comes in. I personally I think my experiences as a Filipina American Catholic who spent a significant amount of her time in the Philippines helps me bring a sense of the relationship between church and academy that's I've come to discover is very different from other colleagues. And the place of faith in church in communities of color, I think looks and is experienced differently from maybe the way the dominant white culture, middle class Catholic culture might understand or experience church. And so I find myself wondering if bringing those voices in might be helpful, so that the faith experiences of certain communities might be allowed to speak to an academy that's been predominantly, again, Eurocentric, with very Eurocentric kinds of concerns. I've discovered in conversations with a lot of colleagues, I've been surprised at how faith and church are able to come in a positive way. And maybe it's hearing the positive stories from other colleagues who are coming from communities, very often marginalized communities, for whom this is an important reality, might be helpful in the way we think about those kinds of questions. Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I appreciated you sharing some of these thoughts with me earlier. And I was in a different place as I was reading that question maybe 2 days ago. As I hear you now, I'm just really aware of communities of color who are Catholic communities of color, I think have something to contribute to that question.
I want to call folks' attention to Sheila and Tom's comments in the chat as well, which add to the conversation. I don't need to read them to you. What are some other thoughts that surface as you reflect on Catherine, what we heard from Catherine or the conversation so far?
If I can ask a question, I'm wondering, Catherine mentioned a lot about women religious, and I thought about that group mentioned for a long time in the book. But I'm aware that years ago, in fact, the number of there was an example where Protestant schools were counting the number of women who were leading colleges and universities, and they actually excluded the nuns because they were in a different category, as if that was I guess it was an early gender experiment or something like that. But now when I go to meetings over the years, I see fewer women actually as presidents of Catholic colleges and universities. And I'm wondering, maybe if you can talk a little bit about the difference of being authorized as a laywoman in the institutions. I mean, our own institution, we don't have that history of women's leadership, and now we have, other than our president, all women vice presidents on campus. But there's still, I'm wondering about the experience of how we authorize women, lay women to lead, and whether lay women today sort of find a good example of the religious women who did it, or if that's just seen as being so different from the challenges that lay women today are facing as vice presidents or presidents or deans or whatever way they exercise leadership in their institution.
Tom, as you asked that question again, I'm struck by the thought that how our colleges are located in different parts of the country. And so there exist very different Catholic cultures. So if I were just to speak, for example, of my experience at Seattle University and my very new experience at Detroit Mercy, I think being a lay woman of color in Seattle, as a leader trying to engage people around the Catholic intellectual tradition, I think people were more open to me entering into that space than if I were, say, a white male Jesuit, well, a Jesuit priest, right? A white Jesuit priest, because there was an openness to the way to my experiences as a Catholic woman of color. And there was, I think, less of a sense of a threat in some ways. On the other hand, at Detroit Mercy, I am finding, at least, again, I'm still getting to know the culture, so let me begin by saying that. But the sense that I've gotten so far is right now, I'm still hanging some of my legitimacy in my relationships and my bringing Jesuits and Mercies with me in some of the spaces. I don't know if the time will come where they're not going to look for father and sister. I mean, I'm hoping the time will come when they're not going to look for father and sister. But right now, in this particular Catholic context, I'm finding myself in the Midwest, I may have less authority. I may be seen as less authorized. Whereas in the Pacific Northwest, I think I actually was better positioned because I am a lay woman of color to be able to accomplish really deep engagement with the Catholic intellectual tradition in the way I'd envision at a university. Don't know if that's helpful, but that's the experience.
Every now and again, I feel like I can get away with something. You framed it much more positively, Catherine, but since the clerics don't expect much out of a woman, if I can get anything done, it's the difference between power and maybe the difference between power and leadership, or power and authority, is that I can kind of sneak some stuff in because I'm not an official leader of the church or an official leader of the university. And I try to, like Spider-Man, use that great power wisely. And your emphasis on that, you noted that women often bring to encounters on relationship. My colleague Nora Martin reminded us at another meeting of Marianist's commitment to stay at the table, that women tend to stay in relationship and do what it takes to maintain the relationship rather than splinter off. And I think if there's a charism that will get us through the challenges of the next 10 years, I think staying at the table and valuing relationship is going to be at least in the top two.
And if I may, I'm also, as you say that, Karen, and with regard to authority, I think part of the thing that also strikes me is for whom, right? In other words, if part of what my roles have allowed me, or the purpose of a lot of my roles has been to engage faculty, colleagues, and administrators. And I think, in a sense, in those spaces, I may be listened to and heard better because they can identify with my social location better than someone who might be a clergy or someone who's a woman religious. But the way that that authority is received by, let's say, upper administration or my bishop, that's going to look a little different. Or maybe some of the Catholics outside of the institution, right? So with whom or for whom are you exercising authority might be an important question to ask as well. I think I get to be effective in my job because of the particular folks with whom I get to work or have to work. And I hope to help influence and draw to the intellectual tradition and to the work of our institutions.
Well, I think you've given us a lot of portable tools to whatever our orbit, whatever our context, to contemplate and to exercise real power, the power of relationship and human potential and prayer. Thank you for the reminder of prayer and peacemaking. Tom, I think it's going to go on your considerable shoulders to bring us to closure.
Okay, well, thank you to everyone for being here. I appreciate that, Catherine's contributions and Karen's comments, and it's good to see so many familiar faces. I'm glad you're all here. So I wish you all a happy afternoon or evening, depending on where you are. So take care. Good night.